The homily for the second Sunday of Eastertide, or prayer book, first Sunday after Easter. It's Low Sunday, it's the end of the Easter octave. Those are 8 special days, all singing, all dancing to proclaim Alleluia. And then we move nicely through Eastertide, with the climax being Pentecost. We're on the Ascension. So Ascension comes towards the end of Eastertide, but we keep going with our Eastertide theme right the way through to the birthday of the church, the third great festival of the church, Easter, Christmas, Pentecost. So on this Low Sunday, Easter 2, you'll find our readings on the St Michael's website. They'll have our service sheet, which we've kept going, and that's been posted. And I thought for this reflection I'd look at 1 Peter 1, 3-9, and it's the latter half of our epistle from verse 6, which I'll read to you. In this you rejoice, even if now for a little while you have had to suffer without trials. So the genuineness of your faith, be more precious than gold, that, though perishable, is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honour when Jesus Christ is revealed. Although you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him, you believe in him and rejoice with an indescribable and glorious joy, for you are receiving the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. So the theme for this Sunday is Easter joy, and you pick up that in the latter half of that reading from 1 Peter 1. Easter joy. Some thoughts on Easter joy. Well, something which I haven't particularly broadcasted, but it's something been with me for a long time, is my love of black gospel music. So if you go to the Deep South, to the southern states, say the Georgia Gospel Choir, great institutions like that, I love that music. Very different to the sort of music we have in St Michael's on any given Sunday, more reserves that are Anglican Episcopalian style, which we go for, which is fitting for our tradition. So the black gospel music is almost the opposite to that, brimming with emotion. And the theology behind it, I'm not entirely at ease with, because there's the sense of singing about the glory which is to come. So a lot of praise, sometimes very charismatic, sometimes glossolalia, speaking, singing in tongues. But it's about the glory which is Christ won for us, which we all celebrate. And we will receive that, as it were, we'll really enter into that once we die and be promoted to glory, as the Salvation Army says. My somewhat ambivalent and unease about this is that this Easter joy is for now. It's what we experience in the present. And I think that's really important, to be living in the present moment, not just for what is coming. We understand with these so-called Negro spirituals, it was for people under immense hardship, and to get through that they needed a vision of something which would be much greater, give them much greater joy in the future, once they'd been liberated from the plantations and so on. So we understand the angle of that, but for me it's about the present. Now, when we think of our present, the name on our lips is Coronavirus, COVID-19, we just can't get away from that. It's something we live with day to day. Our news is full of it. And there is, of course, considerable suffering. I don't know about you, but I just find the numbers extremely difficult to take in. I see it on the television screen, but when you think about 800, 900 people dying in the UK on a daily basis, and quite often if you're watching the BBC, there are figures of people dying in hospital in England and Wales, so it's greater than that. It's just horrific, and it's extremely difficult just to absorb those figures, and you almost don't want to enter into it too intensely, because to think of so many people dying in our country is too horrendous. And that's just here in the UK. Globally, of course, the picture is much worse. So there's certainly plenty of suffering around, and that's if you like, from a physical angle. But what isn't publicised particularly is the mental anguish which people are going through. Of course, extremely hard to get any stats on that, but we know there's plenty of it about, and when professionals in this field talk about it, we can well believe it, and maybe we feel some of that ourselves. And then there is the economic impact. I had a little bit of an email exchange to an old school friend of mine this week who's a businessman in the US, has quite a large company. He's saying that he can foresee things being just about okay for the time being, having really pared down the company. But for how long? For how long before the whole thing crashes? Immense concerns with the economics of it all, how we recover and so on. So not in any way playing down the suffering of what COVID-19 has brought to us across the globe. But maybe we can think about some of the lessons which we can already learn now, and maybe some of the positives about this new norm which we are living in. Recently I suggested an opportunity of seeing the resurrected Christ in ourselves and in other people. And I think part of that comes from our forced slowing down, that we can't rush around as many of us used to do before this virus took hold and we were put in lockdown. Our cars are sitting on our driveways, in our garages and so on. Many of us staying put, as we are asked to do, unless we have to through work. And of course the shopping and medicine and so on, but basically staying put. A slowing down for us, which we can reap some of those benefits of living at a slower pace. So we can observe more. I suggest we can listen more. Some of those conversations we might have with people can possibly go to a greater depth. I do realise that it's very difficult for us to actually be with people physically, face to face. But then there's FaceTime and so on. With these Zoom groups, you can do one-to-one and traditional means of communication, using the phone. And these sorts of conversations, what might we learn from that? How might we develop deeper relationships than maybe what we've had in the past? Certainly for myself, doing rather more contact, primarily through email, but rather more contact with blood relations so often down south, which so often don't have the sort of time to make those sorts of connections. I would suggest these are some of the positive things, some of the things which COVID-19 might have taught us, living this lifestyle, and when we get to the other side of this crisis, maybe we have learnt some things, and we can not just go back to the way which we were living, and importantly, maybe give a little more time for our fellow human beings, for our kith and kin, and so on. But the joy. My experience has been when things have been difficult, problematic, when I've experienced so-called failures, actually those have been great times of learning. And I've learned about maybe particularly myself, my response to the predicament I might have found myself in, something I've not achieved, which maybe I badly wanted to achieve. That's been a huge learning curve. And in entering into that, there's been a time eventually maybe of finding some peace about that and some deep-seated joy. Because maybe those things which I strived for were not the best things for me, and what maybe I've ended up doing has been of far greater benefit, far more fruitful, and given myself far more like peace and pleasure. So the suffering bit isn't necessarily so bad, not taken away from the horrors of the impact of COVID-19. A person who I've been captivated by really since I was a boy is St. Francis of Assisi. And when I think about joy, I think of St. Francis. His life, from a wealthy merchant Umbrian family, northern central Italy, lots of beautiful cloth around the place, lived a good life at that time in that part of Europe. What did he do? Well, as people well know, he gave it all up. All that wealth, all that material comfort, and he wore a very plain robe, and he physically built churches brick by brick, stone by stone, and then he went on to build God's church with a particular preaching ministry, an itinerant preacher. A life of luxury, much materialism, much wealth, to a life of having nothing, and living very, very simply indeed. This life of being itinerant, of going to marketplaces and proclaiming the gospel. He experienced, as we understand it, real joy and deep-seated joy. He knew the resurrected Christ within himself. Indeed, almost towards the end of his life, he received the stigmata. He wanted to come so close to Christ, but that, of course, gave him considerable physical pain. So joy is not necessarily sort of frothy on the surface. It's something deep within us. And it's something we celebrate, certainly for the octave of Easter, right the way through Eastertide, taking us to the great festival of Pentecost, the great 50 days of Eastertide. Despite what we're going through at the moment, may you truly experience and celebrate that Easter joy. Amen.